This is Wang Ling, also known as WLOP, a digital artist known for their cinematic paintings with a perfect balance of light and shadow, characters filled with heartfelt emotions, scenes and compositions rich in stories. I've admired WLOP's art for years now, even before I became an artist. Every time I came across their works, I would immediately recognize their style, as well as being stunned by how beautiful they are. For the longest time, I'm convinced this level of skill is unreachable. From the lighting, the atmosphere, the composition, it all felt like something only WLOP could pull off. But after spending years drawing and slowly understanding art, I've become just crazy enough to try. So this video is about my attempt to study WLOP's process and understanding what makes his illustrations so mesmerizing, and eventually trying my best to apply the things I've learned into my own illustration attempt. I figured the best way to begin is by observing WLOP's painting process. Thankfully, WLOP shares many time-lapse videos on their YouTube channel, and that became the foundation of my research, and I will be referring to them the most. WLOP also offers exclusive tutorials and artworks over on their Patreon, as well as other paid content. But in this video, I'll only be covering the publicly available sources. Still, if you're interested in a deeper understanding of WLOP's work, you can check them out for yourselves. Links will be in the description. Almost every time-lapse I watch, WLOP always draws with a very loose and messy sketch. He uses a small, hard round brush and only sketches just enough to get the silhouette and rough composition down. Most of the details like jewelry, clothing folds, and hair strands is added during or sometimes even after the rendering stage. The messiness thus means fewer constraints. It's easier to adjust and fix large mistakes without erasing too much. Having a painterly style also means WLOP does most of the creative thinking during the painting and rendering stage, instead of putting everything on the sketching phase like I do. One unexpected detail that I noticed was how dark WLOP's base values are. Even when painting white hair, pale skin, or bright clothing, the grayscale values usually starts from a mid to dark tone. My theory is that this sets up a stronger contrast later on by making the characters slightly darker and the background lighter. It also prevents the rendering from being a little too extreme. Almost none of the values in WLOP's artworks ever went to pure black or white. They are always perfectly balanced, which gives it a more realistic lighting. Instead of the usual way of converting grayscales to color, WLOP uses tone curves. A lot of tone curves. This is done early on during his painting process so that he could continue rendering and adding details manually right after. It's not a one and done process either. WLOP would constantly adjust and fix the colors using tone curve, sometimes even all the way until the very end of the painting. His paintings require trusting the process and having a lot of patience. WLOP uses color dodge for most of the lightings. A soft brush is used with low opacity to paint in the lights. Color dodge applies very strong glow to the subject, but is able to create realistic lighting effects. It's also very useful when adding glows to jewelry and subsurface scattering on translucent skins. And finally, one detail that makes WLOP work incredible is how the environment interacts with the characters. Bounce light, cast shadow, and subtle color reflections from the surrounding makes the characters believable. It's the kind of things you don't notice at first glance, but it is what makes his world feel genuine. At this point, I had a pretty decent understanding of WLOP's painting process, but knowing the process and actually doing it are two different things. So I gave it a shot. I will be attempting to create an illustration following WLOP's process. So for my first attempt, I started drawing a messy sketch just like WLOP. Well, by the looks of it, it's definitely far from messy. But compared to some of my previous sketches, it sure has much less details. After that, I paint in the grayscales, but instead of layering like WLOP, I separated them into multiple layers as I feared it would get disorganized due to my lack of experience. At the same time, I was following along one of WLOP's time-lapses to hopefully help me better match his workflow. But seeing how even after finishing the grayscale, except the focal point, all the other areas barely has any details. I think this is done because after adding the colors, WLOP will continue refining the details by painting over them again. So naturally, I quickly finished the grayscale and went to coloring with tone curves. However, after comparing mine and WLOP side by side, his already looks clean and refined, while mine still looks unfinished and having very rough brushstrokes. I definitely overestimated my abilities, and rushing the grayscale makes the values not being rendered properly. So I decided to try again, but this time with an even cleaner sketch and a good reference. This time, I'm making sure to nail the grayscale before going into colors. It's mostly the same as the previous attempt, though you might notice that the face I rendered this time is much more towards semi-realism. Next is adding colors. This was my first time coloring with tone curves, so the hues are a little lacking at first because everything looks very desaturated. But for WLOP style, it's important to trust the process, so I continued. One of the most useful tricks I learned to help push the realism style was understanding how blood flow affects the skin. Ironically enough, I actually first heard about this from Teppo's WLOP video. Maybe it's common knowledge among realism artists, but it's definitely something new, at least for me. Areas like the nose, cheeks, ears, fingers, and joints tend to have more blood flow, so they naturally appear warmer. On the other hand, areas with less circulation, like the area beside the eyes, chin, wrists, and back of hand will be slightly cooler. It's a small detail, but it makes a massive difference in bringing the skin to life. After a couple color adjustments, I painted in the lights using color dodge, using a lower opacity soft brush and a darker shade of red. It also creates a very convincing subsurface scattering effect on the skin, finishing off by adding bounce light from the environments. And that's pretty much the entire process. I then proceed to do the same for the hair and the clothes, refining and adding details following a reference. And here's how it turned out.
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. Guess you're trying to stay strong and fake.
Obviously, it's far from perfect. I noticed inconsistent lightings, some unbalanced values, and the overall mood still doesn't fully capture WLOP's signature vibe. But this is a valuable experience, as it's one of the few times I seriously pushed myself to draw realism. And it also gave me a feel of WLOP's workflow and how he approaches rendering. Still, copying WLOP's process alone isn't enough to replicate his masterpieces. But fortunately, there's another element that makes WLOP's painting special. His paintings don't just portray characters, each scene feels like a moment frozen in time, hinting at something larger before and after the frame. From composition to background design, as well as the use of dramatic lighting and contrast. Every element plays a role in depicting emotions and guiding the viewers towards a bigger picture. One key concept I came across through a breakdown by artist Marc Brunet is how WLOP uses contrast to attract focus, usually done through lights and shadows. The main character or focal point is usually drawn with high contrast, while the background elements and secondary figures are softened with lower contrast. This helps the viewer to recognize what matters the most in the scene, even when everything feels just as detailed. Another thing that sets WLOP apart is how he treats the background, not as a filler but as a part of the storytelling. In almost all of his artworks, none of the backgrounds are just plain colors. Instead, the background is drawn to enhance the characters even more. WLOP uses the environments to affect how the characters feel and behave. Take this illustration for example. The characters is framed against the clear blue sky, but the warm orange bounce light reflecting onto her skin and the dusty winds in the background tells you that she's currently in a hot desert environment, without needing a single line of text. These subtle environmental interactions is what makes the scenes feel so real. WLOP sometimes uses 3D rendering for the background of his illustrations. From what I can tell, WLOP models and renders everything all by himself, which gives him full creative control. Not only he can build complex scenes faster, but also controls every camera angle, every piece of detail, as well as every lighting with realistic consistency, which complements well with WLOP's realism style. As for me, I've never touched 3D rendering before, so instead of learning to build models from scratch, I did the next best thing: free 3D asset libraries. Sketchfab, which is where I found most of the models I ended up using. Some of my favorite WLOP pieces are the ones related to medieval, folklore, fantasy vibe. Because of that, I specifically looked for assets like castles, grand halls, and nice statues. So with all that inspiration in mind as well as gathered the materials I needed, I began this story-driven illustration which I titled The Last Vow. But this actually wasn't my initial idea. At first, I wanted to draw something much more festive, something grander, lighter, and full of life. One of the earlier concepts was a royal coronation scene. Another sketch showed a ceremonial hallway, with knights all kneeling in honor as the princess passed them by. But following that, I ended up with this: a lone knight kneeling before a winged princess in an empty, grand hallway. Not quite sure why I decided on this, I just got a feeling that this scene shows off a stronger emotions and has more room for storytelling. First, I started by cleaning up the sketch. Just like before, I added the base values after, with subject closer to the viewer being the knight, having a darker value to show depth. The princess is drawn with a sorrowful expression, showing that in this moment something is very wrong, despite the knight kneeling to show sovereignty. After rendering the characters, I made the wings a little bigger, which kind of hints that the princess is not all weak and helpless. This is also done so that this part of the wing can guide the viewer's eyes towards the princess. After rendering the hallway and fixing some awkward parts, I added the signature WLOP jewelry. I used a basic hard brush to draw in the silhouettes and kinda just scribbled around brushstrokes to show shapes and texture. A reference would be helpful for this, or you can also use any one of WLOP's paintings like me. So before I go to the coloring, here is the final grayscale, as well as my layering. Since the princess and the knight are each on one layer respectively, I use lasso to select the parts that I want to adjust the color of. And just like before, I added colors using tone curve. The story I want to portray here is that the knight is kneeling not in glory but as an apology for surviving the Great War when his fellow knights did not. The last knight who could no longer uphold the oath he swore to protect. The princess doesn't smile, nor does she cry, her gaze being soft yet filled with unspoken sorrow, as if the world has changed far beyond recognition. Both of them alone in an empty palace which used to house 1,000 knights. Surrounded by statues of reminiscence, like peace came at a price too steep to celebrate. Before showing the final piece, I used the 3D assets I found earlier for the background. I imported them in and paint over them to match the style. This saves a lot of time and lets me create convincing statues and buildings without the need of drawing everything from scratch. Though WLOP does this effect much better as he creates the models all by himself. Okay, enough stalling. Here is the finished illustration, The Last Vow. I'm actually really happy with how this turned out. While it's nowhere near WLOP's level of mastery, I do feel like I managed to capture a part of the atmosphere and storytelling that makes his artwork so powerful. And more than that, I genuinely enjoyed painting in semi-realism. It's challenging, but the results paid off. Studying WLOP has been a surreal experience. I always thought this level of artistry was something unreachable, and it kinda still is, in many ways. But breaking down his workflow and attempting his process helped me to see that improvements are always possible. If you're interested in learning more about WLOP, I will leave links to his YouTube as well as their socials and Patreon in the description below. I hope the tips I shared managed to help you out in your own art journey, and with that all out of the way, thank you for watching.